The galactic capital was not a city. It was a world made of metal and light, a shining jewel at the very center of the empire. Billions of citizens lived there, and trillions across the stars looked to it as the heart of power. It was here that laws were passed, wars were declared, and rulers were made. And it was here, on this day, that humanity arrived. The empire had prepared for it. Weeks of planning had gone into the moment. Soldiers filled the streets, standing in lines that stretched for kilometers. Armored carriers floated above the roads, their cannons already glowing with stored energy. Warships circled the skies like vultures, engines roaring, shadows falling across the towers below. The Emperor's orders had been clear. The humans must be shown strength. If they tried to resist, they must be crushed. Crowds gathered behind walls of guards, whispering with nervous voices. They had heard stories of humans, stories of fire, chaos, and worlds broken in war. Some said humans were too wild to be controlled. Others said they were too weak to survive outside their small blue planet. None of them knew what was true, but all of them waited, breaths held, for the first sight of the strangers who had shaken the galaxy. And then, without warning, the ships arrived. Dark shapes slipped from the sky, small and simple compared to the massive fleets of the Empire. No banners, no escorts, no grand display. Only a few silent transports touched down on the landing platform at the heart of the capital. The crowd gasped. The soldiers tightened their grip on weapons. The air itself seemed to grow heavy. The doors opened. Humans walked out. They did not rush. They did not bow. They did not shout or sing. Step by step they crossed the platform in silence, their boots striking the floor with sharp echoes that carried through the open space. No words, no gestures, just a calm, steady march toward the waiting guards. The Empire had expected cries of fear. They had expected panic, anger, or even demands. But the humans gave them nothing. Silence. The commander of the guard, a tall alien with armor shining like black stone, stepped forward. His voice echoed through the speakers above the plaza. "By order of the Emperor, you will state your reason for entering the capital." Every eye turned to the humans. Every ear strained to hear. But no answer came. The humans only stopped walking, standing together as one. They looked at the commander, their faces unreadable. No emotion, no fear, no pride, just silence. The commander frowned. He repeated his demand louder this time. His soldiers shifted behind him, uneasy. Still, the humans said nothing. The silence stretched longer, thicker, heavier. The crowd began to whisper nervously. The commander felt his hands tighten into fists. "Speak!" he shouted at last, his voice cracking. The humans did not move. That was when the fear began. Not fear of weapons, not fear of fleets. The Empire had prepared for those. They were ready for fire and blood, but they were not ready for this complete, unshaken silence that felt more dangerous than any weapon. It was as if the humans carried something invisible with them, something the Empire could not measure or control. The commander took a step back without meaning to. His men looked at him, waiting for orders, but even they could not hold their ground without unease. The silence pressed against them, heavier with every second, and then one of the humans did move. Only a single step forward, only the sound of a boot on the floor. Yet it was enough to send a ripple through the entire crowd. Soldiers tightened their grips. Civilians gasped. The commander almost gave the order to fire, but still, no weapon was raised by the humans. No word was spoken. They only walked forward again, calm and silent, as if the fleets above, the armies around, and the eyes of billions meant nothing at all. Inside the command halls of the Empire, leaders watched the scene unfold on great screens. Some leaned forward, confused. Some whispered to each other in panic. The Emperor himself sat rigid on his throne, his golden eyes narrowing as he studied the strange newcomers. He had expected chaos. He had prepared for violence. But this silence unsettled him more than any war could. The humans were no longer just visitors. They were a question without words but with weight, a question that the Empire did not know how to answer. As the humans passed through the gates of the capital, the crowds pressed back against the walls, unable to look directly at them. It was not the sight of human weapons that terrified them. It was not even their numbers. It was the feeling that these silent beings had already seen the weakness in the Empire and were holding their silence like a blade. And so, step by step, the humans entered the heart of the galactic capital. Soldiers stood frozen. Leaders whispered in fear. The Emperor clenched his fists. The Empire had prepared for panic. It had prepared for battle, but instead it received only silence, and that silence was louder than war. The humans had entered the capital. The gates closed behind them with a heavy sound, and the streets that once roared with voices now felt like tombs. Soldiers stood at attention, but their hands shook against the barrels of their rifles. Even the air seemed thinner, as if silence itself had taken away breath. Inside the tall marble halls of the Galactic Senate, the silence followed. The footsteps of the humans echoed along the wide corridors, too steady, too calm. The sound made ministers flinch. The guards, who usually carried themselves with pride, now shifted their eyes to the ground. Unwilling to meet the humans' gaze, whispers filled the chambers long before the humans arrived. "Why do they not speak?" one alien counselor muttered. "They should plead or threaten," another said nervously. "Anything but this." "They are waiting," a third whispered. "Waiting for something we cannot see." The Emperor's throne chamber was a place built to crush visitors with awe. Tall pillars carved from black stone rose like towers. Golden lights shone down from above. Murals of victories and conquests decorated the walls, reminders of the Empire's endless power. Usually, any species brought here would tremble before even seeing the throne, but the humans did not tremble. They walked slowly down the carpeted path toward the Emperor's dais. The silence they carried with them filled the chamber like smoke. It curled around the pillars, sank into the corners, and weighed heavily on every chest. Ministers who had spoken too loudly before now stayed silent themselves, as though even their words might break against this strange wall of quiet. The Emperor leaned forward in his throne. His robes shimmered with golden thread, and his crown burned with the fire of gems from conquered worlds. His voice was deep and trained to command. "Humans," he said, each syllable sharp, "you stand in the heart of my empire. You come without invitation. You come without a single word of respect. You will answer me now." The chamber trembled with his voice. His ministers nodded quickly, forcing courage into their faces. The soldiers tightened their ranks. The humans stopped walking. They lifted their heads and looked at the Emperor, but they did not speak. The Emperor's hands gripped the arms of his throne. He repeated his demand, louder, stronger. "Speak! Tell me why you have come!" Still the humans gave him nothing, only silence. The silence spread again, heavier than his words. The ministers shifted nervously in their seats. The guards glanced at each other. Even the Emperor, for all his power, felt something he had not felt in years. Uncertainty. What were these humans hiding? What was their plan? The generals around him began to argue in hurried whispers. They must be planning an attack. "No, perhaps they are testing our nerves. We should crush them now, before it is too late." But none dared to move. The silence was like a storm cloud, pressing down on the chamber. Every breath sounded too loud, every heartbeat like a drum. The humans stood there unbroken, and the Empire's leaders felt their strength draining away with every second of quiet. One minister, shaking, tried to stand tall. He shouted across the chamber, "You think your silence frightens us? You are nothing. Say something or be destroyed." The human closest to him turned their heads slowly. Their eyes locked on the minister. No words, no gesture, only a stare. The minister froze mid-sentence. His voice broke. He sank back into his seat, pale and trembling. The silence had answered him more strongly than any threat could. The Emperor's fury grew. "Do you mock us with this stillness?" he roared. His crown shook as he slammed his fist on the throne. "Do you think silence makes you powerful? Speak." But deep inside, he already knew the truth. The humans were not mocking him. They were not afraid. Their silence was deliberate. It was a weapon, sharper than any blade, stronger than any fleet. And the more the Empire demanded answers, the more that silence grew into something unstoppable. In that moment, the Emperor realized the danger. Words could be challenged. Weapons could be countered. But silence forced the enemy to face themselves. It turned their own doubts against them. And doubt was poison. The humans had not brought ships to the capital. They had not brought armies or bombs. They had brought only themselves. And yet, somehow, the Empire already felt as though it was losing. When the session ended, the humans were guided to their quarters deep inside the capital's inner palace. They walked calmly, as if everything was already decided. The guards who led them felt their hands sweating on their weapons, praying the humans would not suddenly turn and look at them. Behind the closed doors of the throne chamber, the Emperor's voice thundered again. We prepared for war. We prepared for screams, for fire, for rebellion. And yet we face silence. Silence. Tell me, what enemy fights with silence? No one had an answer. The halls of the Empire had always echoed with voices, power, and pride. But after the humans entered, all that remained was unease. Silence followed them wherever they walked, and with every step, the fear of the Empire grew. The Empire had expected panic. It had prepared for battle, but now it faced something it could not fight. It faced the silence of humanity, and already it was losing ground. The humans were given chambers in the inner palace, yet it was no gift. The rooms were beautiful, carved with crystal walls and flowing lights, but the guards outside the doors were armed with plasma rifles. The Empire called it hospitality, but everyone knew it was a cage. Still, the humans did not complain. They did not protest. They sat together in silence, calm as stone. Outside the chamber, the ministers argued. The council chamber shook with their voices. They mock us. They are testing us. No, they are planning something. Silence hides plots. I say we strike now before it is too late. The Emperor sat high above them all, his golden eyes burning. He let them shout, let their fear spill into the air. For once, their noise was almost a comfort because it was familiar. But the silence of the humans, it was unfamiliar, unnatural, and it was spreading like a shadow through every hall of his capital. When the Emperor finally raised his hand, the chamber fell quiet. Enough, he said, his voice low but heavy. We expected fire. We expected threats. But silence. Silence is worse. They think their quiet will shake us. They think they can stand here without words and make us doubt ourselves. He leaned forward, his crown glinting in the light. Then we must not doubt. We must show them power until silence breaks. The generals nodded, eager for orders, but no one moved to act. Deep down, even they feared that breaking the silence might reveal something they were not ready to face. The first meeting. The next day, the humans were led into the great council chamber. 1,000 alien delegates filled the seats, each from a different world of the Empire. They came not only to witness the strange visitors, but to study them, to see if the stories were true. The humans entered as they had before, quiet, steady, and unshaken. Their boots echoed on the marble floor. Their faces betrayed no fear. At the center of the chamber, the Emperor sat tall upon his throne. The delegates watched with sharp eyes. Everyone expected that today, finally, the humans would speak. The Emperor's voice cut through the hall. You stand in the heart of my empire. Speak your purpose. Do you come in peace, or do you come to test us? The silence that followed was crushing. The humans looked at the Emperor. They looked at the delegates, but they did not speak. Not a single word. A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. Some delegates shifted in their seats. Others clenched their hands against the arms of their chairs. The silence felt alive, pressing against their skin, sinking into their thoughts. The Emperor narrowed his eyes. Do you mean to insult us? Do you believe silence makes you strong? Again, no answer. A murmur began among the delegates. It started soft, then grew louder. Fear crept into their voices. Why do they not speak? What are they hiding? Perhaps they do not need to speak. And then, from somewhere deep in the chamber, a delegate whispered words that chilled everyone around him. Perhaps silence is their answer. The room froze. Those words seemed to settle like dust over the entire chamber. Perhaps silence was the answer. Perhaps it was the message itself. The emperor's jaw tightened. His ministers looked to him for guidance, but even he felt his chest grow heavier. If silence was their answer, then what did it mean? Defiance, confidence, or worse, certainty? The breaking point to prove control, the emperor called for a display of power. From the floor of the chamber, a platform rose. On it stood a war machine, tall and armed with glowing weapons. "This," the emperor declared, "is the power of the empire. One order from me and worlds burn. Your silence will not protect you." The humans turned their eyes to the machine. Still, no fear showed on their faces. One of them stepped forward, slow, steady. He raised his hand, not to fight, not to point, but simply to place it over his chest. That single gesture, small and quiet, made the chamber tremble more than the sight of the war machine. Because it was not fear. It was not surrender. It was something else. Something the aliens could not name, but could feel in their bones. The machine, tall and glowing, suddenly felt meaningless. The emperor's voice cracked as he barked, "Enough of this! You will speak!" But still the humans gave nothing. The silence returned, heavier than ever. The delegates lowered their eyes. The generals clenched their jaws. And somewhere in that silence, the empire felt the first fracture in its own armor. The challenge, unspoken. That night, as the humans returned to their chambers, the halls buzzed with whispers. No one dared to say it out loud, but everyone thought the same thought. The empire had shouted, threatened, and displayed its greatest power. The humans had answered with silence, and in that silence the empire had felt weaker. The challenge was clear. Though no words were spoken, who would break first? The empire with its endless words and weapons, or humanity with its silence that spoke louder than both? And in the quiet corners of the palace, soldiers and ministers alike began to wonder if the war had already been lost. The silence of the humans spread like a disease through the capital. It clung to the streets, slipped into the markets, and followed the guards back to their homes. At first, the people had mocked it. "They are only mute," some whispered. "They do not speak because they are weak." But as the days passed, no one dared to laugh, because silence does not weaken. It waits, it grows, and soon the empire felt it everywhere. Soldiers of the empire, the soldiers, were the first to feel it. They had been trained to face monsters, rebels, and fleets of war. They had weapons, armor, and endless drills, but no one had trained them for silence. When humans walked by their ranks, the soldiers stood stiff, holding rifles close. But inside their hearts raced. Their throats dried. The silence pressed on them until they wanted to shout just to break it. Some even did, whispering curses under their breath. Insults they thought would protect them, but the humans never answered, and that was worse than any threat. One soldier admitted to another in the barracks, "I wish they would yell. I wish they would fight. Anything but this." The other soldier, pale and sleepless, only nodded. Silence had followed him into his dreams. The emperor's anger. In the high palace, the emperor grew restless. He had once believed no one could shake his throne. But the longer the humans stayed quiet, the more his power seemed hollow. His words felt weaker when thrown against silence. His threats lost strength when no one reacted. At meetings, he slammed his fist and demanded answers. Why do they not speak? Why do they not bend? His generals had no reply. One finally dared to whisper, "Perhaps their silence is a strategy, Majesty." The emperor's eyes burned. "Then it is a strategy that must be broken." He ordered endless shows of strength. Warships roared above the capital in tight formations. Cannons fired into empty skies, their blasts shaking the city. Whole divisions marched through the streets, their boots thundering. The air was filled with noise meant to bury silence. But when humans appeared, all the sound meant nothing. Their steady, wordless steps crushed the empire's noise as easily as stone crushes paper. Cracks in the capital. The people of the capital began to fear. At first, they had gathered in crowds to watch the humans. But now, they hid in their homes when humans passed. Mothers pulled children away from windows. Shopkeepers closed their stalls early. Priests whispered prayers to gods long forgotten. A rumor began that the humans' silence was not silence at all. Some claimed it was a weapon, invisible and powerful. Others believed it was a curse, that every word spoken in their presence fed the humans' strength. And so, slowly, the people began to grow quiet too. Old districts that once rang with the sound of trade now fell into uneasy hush. The silence had infected the capital itself. A single movement, the emperor could bear it no longer. He ordered a gathering at the Great Plaza, the same place where the humans had first landed. Tens of thousands of soldiers lined the square. Citizens were dragged from their homes to watch. Above, fleets of warships hovered, cannons glowing. The message was clear. The Empire would show power until silence broke. When the humans arrived, they walked into the plaza as they always had, calm, steady, unshaken. The Emperor rose on a balcony high above, his voice booming through the air. "Behold the strength of the Empire!" At his signal, the cannons fired into the sky. Explosions lit the heavens. The crowd covered their ears. The plaza shook under the thunder of endless weapons. And then, quiet again. The humans stood at the center untouched, their faces calm. One of them lifted a hand, not a weapon, not a threat, just a simple, slow raising of the hand. The entire plaza froze. Tens of thousands of soldiers, citizens, and even the emperor himself fell silent. That one motion was enough. It carried more weight than all the thunder that had come before. The emperor's throat tightened. He wanted to shout another order, to cover the fear building in his chest. But he could not. The words would not come. Because he knew, everyone knew, that silence had already defeated the noise, the tremble. That night the soldiers whispered of what they had seen. A single hand raised, and an entire empire had gone quiet. The fear spread from barracks to homes, from markets to temples. Even the emperor's throne room felt colder, emptier, and for the first time the mighty empire trembled, not from war, not from weapons, but from silence. The humans had never fired a shot. They had never spoken a word. Yet, with silence, they had shaken the greatest power in the galaxy. The Emperor lay awake in his golden chambers, his fists clenched. He had prepared for panic, he had prepared for war, but nothing had prepared him for this. The silence had grown too heavy to ignore. It clung to the towers of the capital like a second skin, wrapped around the streets and filled the lungs of every citizen. The Empire had built its rule on fear, on words shouted from thrones, on orders barked by commanders. But now, none of those words mattered. Silence had become the ruler of the city. The Emperor sat alone in his private chamber. His crown rested heavy on his head, but it felt like a chain. His hands shook as he poured himself wine, though he did not drink it. He stared at the reflection in the golden cup, but all he could see was the steady eyes of the humans. They had not spoken. They had not begged. They had not threatened. Yet their presence had split his empire in ways 1,000 armies could not. The breaking point. At dawn, the humans were summoned again, this time to the throne chamber for a final meeting. The Emperor had ordered it himself. "This will end today," he told his ministers. But his voice was hollow, and they heard it. The throne chamber filled with generals, ministers, and alien rulers from every world of the empire. They had come to watch the end of the silence, to see the emperor bend it to his will, but even they felt the weight of doubt as they waited. When the doors opened, the humans entered slowly. Their steps echoed across the chamber floor. No guards touched them, no chains held them. They did not need chains. Their silence was already stronger than any lock. The emperor rose from his throne, his golden robe shining in the high light. His voice boomed, trained to carry across battlefields and command legions. "Humans, you have come uninvited. You have stood in my capital silent and proud. You think silence makes you strong, but I tell you now, it ends here. You will speak, or you will be crushed." His words echoed. The chamber shook with the sound. Yet when the echoes died, silence returned, heavier than before. The humans looked at him. They did not blink. They did not bow. They gave him nothing. Collapse of power. The Emperor's fury rose. He raised his hand to command the guards. Seize them! But no soldier moved. They stood frozen, rifles in hand, eyes wide. The silence pressed against them like a storm. They could not breathe. They could not lift their weapons. The silence had already taken their courage. The Emperor shouted again, louder this time, but his words fell dead in the air. The silence was louder than him, and then, without warning, one of the humans stepped forward. Slowly, calmly, they lowered themselves onto one knee. Their head bowed. No words, no sound, only silence. Gasps filled the chamber. For a moment it looked like surrender, but then others felt it. The shift, the unspoken weight. This was not surrender. It was a challenge. The Emperor's ministers whispered in fear. "What does it mean?" "It is a declaration," another said. "Not with words, but with silence. They do not yield, they claim." The Emperor's crown felt heavier. His hands trembled as he tried to speak again, but no sound came. His voice had abandoned him. The silence had taken it. The silent victory in that chamber. Something broke, not in the humans, but in the Empire itself. Ministers lowered their heads. Generals shifted uneasily. The once mighty voice of the Empire was gone, because silence had conquered it. The humans rose again, their faces calm, and turned to leave. No one stopped them, no one dared. The doors opened, and they walked out as they had entered, steady, wordless, unshaken. Behind them, the throne room was left in ruins, not of stone or metal, but of power. The Emperor sank back onto his throne, his crown slipping down his brow. His voice was gone, his control was gone, and in the halls beyond, whispers began. The Empire has fallen. Not with war, not with fire, not with screams, but with silence. The day remembered years later, when historians recorded the story. They did not call it the day of war or the day of rebellion. They called it the day silence won. It was the day the humans walked into the heart of the Empire without weapons, without demands, without words. The day their silence crushed fleets, broke armies, and bent an emperor to fear. It was the day the galaxy learned a truth it would never forget. Silence, in the hands of humanity, was louder than war.